want you to say what the four freedoms were, each of them, and then just sort of explain what that meant, because these are just words, right?
Yeah, sure.
And
Well, but
yeah,
but as you know, words matter. So let's make sure
right,
people know what they refer to.
exactly.
So let me put it in the context of FDR's vision, basically, of America and the world. So FDR ran for president the first time in 1932, and the United States and the world, the United States, perhaps worst of all, was in the midst of a terrible depression, Great Depression, capital G and capital D. And that depression led to an unemployment rate approaching 30%, for African Americans approaching 50%. Um, I mean, people were losing their homes, they were losing their farms. Teenagers were told by their parents they had to get out of the house because the parents couldn't afford to protect them and feed them and all of that. And maybe several 100,000 teenagers hit the road during the 1930s. When people lost their homes, they ended up creating shacks that came to be called Hoovervilles outside of towns and cities. So when FDR ran, he started to outline projects that he had already begun to pursue as governor of New York from 1928 to 1932. And, he talked about the imperative of addressing the American environment, providing jobs, creating power for rural areas that didn't have it, protecting workers' rights, those who did have collective bargaining rights, and they were very few, but at least making sure that unions were not going to be besieged all the more, aggressively by big business. So he laid all this stuff out, and he also included a vision of Social Security, which of course connects Franklin Roosevelt back to Thomas Paine in the 1790s. So Roosevelt gave this really remarkable speech. We all know his speeches. Well, we don't all know his speeches. We know the greatest of his speeches, the Pearl Harbor Day speech, the speech in which he takes the presidency in 1933, where he says, "We have nothing to fear but fear itself," in the midst of the Depression. And also his speech at the Democratic Convention in 1932, where he lays out and uses the term "a New Deal." Okay, this is crucial. What people don't realize is that I guess it was October of 1932, he gave a speech out in California at the Commonwealth Club, which was a club of very prominent men in the San Francisco Bay Area. And he actually called for the creation of an economic declaration of rights. That was in 1933. So that basically a new Declaration of Independence that would empower working people and small business people against the big corporate titans, the big moguls of industry, you might say. And this really, in many ways, frames the entire administration. And, the New Deal ensues in 33, 34, 35, 36, 37, 38. And in 1939, war broke out in Europe between the fascists, okay, Hitler's Germany and Mussolini's Italy, versus France and Britain. And France was overrun. And by the end of 1940, Britain was practically the only democracy left in all of Europe. And FDR gave a fireside chat. These were these radio talks that he would give regularly. And he said the United States had to turn itself into the arsenal of democracy and had to lend Britain the kinds of materials and supplies and armaments that would enable Britain to survive the German blitzkrieg, the Nazi attack that was taking place. That was in late December of 39 that he gave that speech. But then in the beginning of that was 1940, not 39. In the beginning of 1941, in what we now call the State of the Union address, he gave a speech that's come to be known as the Four Freedoms speech, which he warns Americans again of the possibility of being attacked by the Nazis, the fascists generally. And he said, they're not going to warn us. And we really do need to supply Britain with the wherewithal to withstand the German attack. And then he shifts gears a little bit and he says, but this doesn't mean we're going to stop pursuing the New Deal. We're going to continue to make sure that Americans are better fed and better clothed, that they get, in fact, he actually mentions healthcare in that speech. And then again, he sort of doesn't pause so much as he shifts the gear a little bit. And he offers a vision of America and the world after the war. The war we haven't even gotten directly into, but this speech in many ways is a call to Americans, a call to arms, to defend ourselves, to provide what we need to withstand a fascist attack, and to provide Britain with what it needs in order to persist. And he says, we look forward to a world characterized by 4 fundamental freedoms. The first is freedom of speech and expression. The second is freedom of worship or freedom of religion. The third, and this is where he shifts, listen to the prepositional shift, freedom from want. And last, freedom from fear. Now, the words he used in those speeches were heard by Americans as a promise. This is what we're about, and this is what we're going to look to secure. Now, freedom of speech and expression and freedom of worship are already indicated in the First Amendment of the Constitution, the first of the Bill of Rights, okay, where there are 4 freedoms indicated: religion, speech, press, and assembly. And what Roosevelt basically was doing is he was reaffirming our historic commitment to pursue those freedoms in those first 2 of the 4 freedoms. But Americans also heard that as a promise that they would be safe on the streets, no matter which religion they practiced, that they not only to pray in a church or a synagogue or whatever, or wherever, but also they would be safe at home in America. Now, when he spoke of freedom from want and freedom from fear, they heard him even more radically than he spoke. Because what he said is freedom from want will create a world in which all nations will have the economies in which they're capable of providing for their citizens. And last but not least, freedom from fear, which would be a control on armaments to limit the capacity of any nation to make war on other nations. Okay. When Americans heard those 2, freedom from want and freedom from fear, they believed that that was a promise that they would continue to pursue the New Deal. Okay, that's first of all. And also that they would pursue the New Deal in a way so that we would enable other countries, okay, to provide food, clothing, and shelter for themselves. I mean, this is an important kind of guarantee. And then the freedom from fear, this is really important. When Americans heard that, if they were African American, it seemed they were being promised that we were going to bring an end to Southern segregation and Northern segregation to the extent that it existed in a social sense, and that, moreover, they would be protected against, well, what we would think of as not just discrimination, but serious, call it, in their minds, Black Lives Matter for the 1940s, you might say, okay? And similarly, Jews and others who were minorities in this country similarly heard that freedom from fear was a promise that they would be able to, that they would be not only full citizens, but they would be guaranteed protections against mobs, against racists, against Klansmen, white supremacists, that kind of. So when Americans heard these 4 freedoms, they heard it not necessarily as a guarantee for the world, which is what FDR tried to project, but that America would truly start to live up to the promise of all men are created equal and life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, and the promise of the First Amendment of the Constitution. Now, FDR didn't stop at that. And this is the other interesting part of it, is that within 3 years, and during the war, by the way, that became, if you like, the manifesto of the American war effort, the 4 freedoms. And progressive groups grabbed hold of it, African-American groups, labor unions, the women's movement. I mean, it really did become the key idea of the war effort. We knew not only what we were fighting against, we knew what we were fighting for. Well, in 1944, again, in January of 1944, this is where FDR takes that original Economic Declaration of Rights idea and the call for the 4 freedoms, the promise of the 4 freedoms, and if in some ways he gives them even more substance, more life. He calls on Americans in 1944 to continue to pursue the war effort. The war's not over yet. We could see victory ahead in Europe, the possibility of an even longer war in Asia against Japanese militarism was likely. And he warned Americans not to start slacking off in the war effort, material production, in supporting the troops overseas. And then he says, in a way, we can look now also to what we want to promise ourselves after the war. And he begins by reminding Americans that in the wake of 8 years of the New Deal and what we've accomplished in the war effort, that we know that needy people are not free people. They're just not free. If you're needy, you are not free. And he lays out, simply put, a second Bill of Rights, an economic Bill of Rights, okay, which includes, the promise of housing, the promise of sufficient food, the food, clothing, shelter, a guarantee of national health care, okay, guarantee of education up to the point to which you're capable of pursuing it and desire to pursue it, a reasonable return on investment, even for business, reasonable, not outrageous.
Yep.
Okay. Protection of farmers, that they can pursue their cultivation and harvesting in a comfortable and reasonable manner. I'm paraphrasing all of this.
Mm-hmm.
He even makes a promise that in this new America, there will be a promise of recreation, which is kind of like an echo of the original idea of the labor movement. 8 hours of work, 8 hours of rest, 8 hours for what we will, meaning 8 hours to pursue happiness. And that's why recreation is essential. So, I mean, it was really a remarkable speech. Now, he knew the Republicans would not buy into it, at least not the majority of them. And he knew that big business would oppose it, okay? In fact, he actually warned Americans to watch out for some elements in the capitalist class that were really right-wingers and would try to completely undo even the advances of the New Deal.
Yeah.
But the key thing here, I know I've gone on, but I want people to understand, the key thing here is that he knew Americans wanted that economic Bill of Rights because they had done, surveys and polls. They had been asking Americans, what do you want after the war? What do you want to pursue after the war? And to give you just one example of just how social democratic minded Americans were, 83, 85 at the most, but 83% of Americans wanted national health care, a guarantee of health care coverage. And by the way, that was like 95% of Democrats and 75% of Republicans, which is to say an overwhelming majority of all Americans wanted it. So if you think about it, the Roosevelt administration years from 33 to 45, he was elected to the presidency 4 times. He died in the first year of his 4th term. Is really about pursuing social democracy.